Thank you very much, Rolf, for that very generous introduction. I should begin by mentioning that for a few months when I was still in Oxford, for some reason I could never fathom, I began to get some of the post of the other John Gray, the best-selling John Gray, the truly best-selling John Gray. And I even, before I realized it wasn't for me, I opened it, and it all seemed to focus around certain eternal dilemmas. Why has he left me? Why has she left me? And let me begin by illustrating what I think, doing the task that Rolf has asked me to do, which is to plant a few questions in your mind about the meaning of progress, the meaning and the content of progress. Back in the 1980s, I lived part of the time in the United States and part of that time in California. And I met some of the people who were then, things have moved on a lot since then, but who were then interested in achieving immortality or exemption from death by cryonic suspension. Many of you may have heard of them. Some of them had spent significant amounts of money having their buying policies whereby when they died, their bodies would be frozen. Some of them who couldn't afford that, or who thought their brains were the most important part of themselves, had cheaper policies which only froze their brains. There were companies providing this service, and I got to know some of them. And I put a question which I don't think had been asked them before, and which they hadn't asked themselves before. I said, remember, this is the 1980s. I said, how long do you think it'll be? Do you have any realistic estimate, or even any guess, as to how long it will be before the technology develops, which will be able to rejuvenate, resuscitate your cooled or frozen body in such a way that the damage that is actually done by the freezing is healed or repaired, and you can come back as you were before, or better, because many of them wanted to come back in better bodies, stronger bodies, different bodies. And the answer I got at that time was commonly 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. Things have moved on since then now. People are now talking about 30 years, 40 years, and some people have even identified the very year. 2043, some say. Others more cautiously say 2045. In those days, people were more modest. They said 100 years, 200 years, to which I responded, okay, I'm not a skeptic about science and technology in that way. In my view, progress in science and in technology is a fact. It's progress in ethics, in politics, in civilization, which is a myth. It's impossible, I said even then, to estimate in advance how far and how quick science and technology will advance. So I wasn't saying to them, I said, I'm not saying to you that that won't happen, or that it might not even happen earlier than you think. Maybe these technologies will develop, or subsequent technologies, for example, now, the next generation of immortalists favor uploading the brain or the information of the brain or the mind from this world into cyberspace. And there are thinkers and writers such as Kurzweil in California who have developed those ideas and even developed plans with regard to it. So if you're interested in taking part, by the way, you can go onto Amazon. You'll find a diet book on Amazon, partly written by Kurzweil, which is a diet book not only to enable you to live longer, but to live forever. Because if you can make it to 2043, you'll live forever. So there are different technologies now than there were there. My skepticism is not about the technologies. My question is not about the technologies. It's about ethics and politics and civilization. So the question I posed to them was, if this is going to take 100 or 150 or 200 years to develop this technology, have you not thought about the last 200 years? In the last 200 years, your country, America, had a devastating civil war in which property rights were changed. A whole part of the country was semi-destroyed. There were advances such as the abolition of slavery, but it was a huge convulsion. There were 2 world wars. There was a catastrophic depression in the 1930s. Countless companies that existed ceased to exist, the vast majority. A few last for over 100 years, but hardly any. Has it not occurred to you that in the next 100 or 150 or 200 years, similar convulsions will happen in the world? Similar upheavals, changes of property rights, changes of the law, wars, terrorism, upheavals will occur. What reason do you have for supposing that the institutions which you're entrusting your money to, which you're entrusting your immortality to, will still be there? What I learned from their blank faces was that they were taking for granted the immortality of the institutions by which they were surrounded. They were seeking immortality against a background of assuming that these American institutions, as they existed at that time, were already immortal. Now, what I think we know is that no institutions are immortal in that way. Even if you look around the world, we find a very small number of countries, of which Switzerland is one, which have had long-term stability without huge interruption. How many? Switzerland, Iceland, whether you count the recent upheaval, Britain maybe, America, a handful. And even they, I would say, will eventually suffer various kinds of mortality and upheaval. And so this illustrates the central point I want to put to you. I'm thrilled by change in technology. I'm thrilled. We've seen so much of it today, which to me was absolutely fascinating. I use it. I use the internet all the time myself. So progress in science and technology is a fact. What do we mean by progress here? We mean cumulative advance. We mean that gains that have been achieved are not lost, typically, and certainly not easily, and they're the basis for further gains. In science and technology, we have not only gains, we have accelerating gains, exponential gains, not just cumulative, but exponential. And this is also true in technology. There may have been a time in human history when, or sometimes when, dark ages have intervened, when knowledge has been lost. There have been such times, but I would suggest to you that this is not such a time. Almost whatever would happen to the world now, almost whatever kind of catastrophe or war or economic dislocation or even climate event would happen, even one that would wipe out 80% of the world's practicing scientists, would not prevent the further accumulation and acceleration of knowledge or of human power through knowledge, because it's stored in all kinds of ways. It's stored on computer disks, the modern versions of the Library of Alexandria that each of us carries about in their pockets. So I think that the momentum of progress in knowledge, in science, and in technology is unstoppable. But in ethics and politics, things are completely different. In ethics and politics, what is gained is very easily, very quickly, sometimes almost invisibly lost before we know it. What we've gained can be lost in the blink of an eye. Now you might say, well, what are some examples of that? Well, there are various at the moment of differing degrees of topicality and urgency. One I suppose we've all lived through, so I won't talk much about it, is that one of the great evils of human life, one of the great evils that any kind of civilization, to my mind, should stamp out, namely torture, was within our lifetime partly rehabilitated in the world's greatest democracy, in America. Waterboarding is torture. At the end of the Second World War, people in the Axis powers who had practiced torture were given 10 or 20 years of hard labor. I'm not a prophet, by the way. I mean, like my friend Nassim Taleb, I take the view that one can't predict the future. But I did in February 2003, that's to say, before the invasion of Iraq, I did publish in the New Statesman in London a spoof article, a satirical article, called Torture, a Modest Proposal, in which I suggested that if torture was going to be used in these wars of liberation, it should be modern torture. It should be torture which had a great concern not only for the victims, but also for the torturer. Torturers have frequently self-image problems. They have legal problems. They have welfare problems. They have odd career structures, often disrupted. So I said, we should really think about this, and we should try and get universities involved in developing a proper modern version of this. And just to make sure that no one took me seriously, the editor of the magazine had a picture taken of me photoshopped wearing Jonathan Swift's wig, the wig that the British satirist Jonathan Swift, which I don't normally wear, I should suggest to you, in everyday life. And he said, that one, everyone will know it's not a joke. It's not true. Hundreds and hundreds of readers rang in and cancelled their subscriptions. The editor was thrilled. But what was the point of that anecdote? What's the point of that? The point is this, that when I did this in February 1983, it seemed impossible, unthinkable. It seemed an exercise in pessimism or despair to think that techniques which definitely were torture in law at that time and had been considered torture in the Second World War would be rehabilitated, would be defended, as they later have been, by Cheney, the American vice president. It's completely unthinkable. And it happened almost in the blink of an eye. That's one example. Are there others? Well, I think there may be even some in Europe. At the moment, I was reading the other day, and this is a point where the progress in knowledge comes up against non-progress in ethics and politics rather sharply and harshly, may be illustrated in Greece. In Greece, because of the austerity cuts, let's not say what caused them, whether they're justified, whether Greeks or the Eurozone has culpability. Let's put all of that on one side. But as part of the cuts, there is an increasing shortage in hospitals of disposable gloves. The disposable gloves that doctors and nurses and other medical professionals wear when they're dealing with patients. And so instead of changing them with every patient or every 5 patients, they're now being changed every 10 patients and every 15 patients. And one of them, disease control inspectors who's recently visited there, said, all we know about this is that it's a mathematical certainty that infection will spread. If before we changed with every patient, and then with 5 patients, and then with 10 patients, other things, people might wash their hands more or whatever, but we know that infection will spread. In other words, as a consequence, I'm sure an unintended consequence of the policies of austerity being applied to Greece, the knowledge we've gained of epidemiology and of medical techniques and of the spread of disease tells us that the unintended consequence of the policies that are required that are believed to be required to preserve the euro and preserve the eurozone is a revival it's an extension of disease. And also it's been reported that because of the same austerity policies, anti-malarial sprays, which were used in Athens and elsewhere, are being curtailed. So malaria could come back. Now, why is this happening? I myself am not perhaps surprising to you coming from Britain, but that's not the reason, because I did not always have these views. I'm rather skeptical about the existing form of the Euro project. But my skepticism could be in this form. The great achievement of the EU, which was part of the inspiration for the project, was to achieve a kind of partial transcendence of some of the worst and most toxic forms of politics, including toxic nationalism. The irony of the present situation is that as a result of the policies, toxic politics, toxic forms of nationalism are returning in various European countries, including Greece. Various forms of neo-Nazism have gone from commanding a vote of 2%, 3% to 20%, 25% in a short period. And this, I suggest to you, is normal in the following sense. If within a short period of time, of a few years, there is a relatively sudden, relatively severe, and then once it's happened, apparently hopeless deterioration in the economic conditions of large numbers of people, I suggest to you it's completely, inexorably predictable that toxic politics will emerge. If large numbers of people don't know why they're suddenly insecure, can't understand it, if it happens, as I say, within a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and if once it's happened, it's very severe and seems semi-insoluble, so when they look forward, they don't see any solution, what they will do is what has happened all too often in Europe in the 20th century and before. They'll blame minorities, immigrants, Jews, gays, others, and they'll start blaming each other. And so you get the preconditions of toxic politics. So one of the paradoxes of modern politics, the politics we've had in Europe for the last couple of 100 years, that's to say, is that in trying to achieve a world in which, say, nationalism, the very imperfect institution we call the nation state, has been transcended and left behind forever. One of the paradoxes of that is you can, in certain circumstances, such as ours now today, create a situation in which the very evils of nationalism that you're trying to escape are accentuated and aggravated and made worse. And I think that's what's actually happening at the moment. Now, why is it that one can have progress in science and technology, but not progress in ethics and politics? Now, I should say the reason isn't, I'm not someone who believes that there are no universal human values. I do think there are universal human values. There are certain things that are good for all human beings and certain things that are bad for all human beings. It's very bad to be tortured, whoever you're tortured by, even if it's an immemorial tradition of torture in your culture. It's bad to be tortured, it's bad to be raped, it's bad to be persecuted, it's bad to be at risk of violent death. And freedom is a good, I would say, for all human beings. Peace is a good for all or most human beings. There are universal human values. So it's not because I think that good and bad differ in different cultures and different traditions and different points of history. The reason is that human beings themselves, the human animal itself, has contradictory impulses and contradictory needs. And so I'm not now attacking an idea of perfection or criticizing an idea of progress, of utopia. What I'm criticizing is actually the idea of progress itself in ethics and politics, which is the idea that we can abolish some evils and then leave them behind forever. We can abolish some evil of persecution or poverty or war or torture or slavery and leave it behind forever. It's gone. It's in the past. If you think that, you'll be perpetually disappointed. You'll be perpetually surprised and disappointed because these evils come back when we're not expecting them, sometimes under different names. So in the 20th century, slavery came back, first in the Gulag, in Nazi Germany, and now in what's called human trafficking. Human trafficking is either slavery or very similar to slavery. Torture's come back, as I mentioned earlier, though it's called enhanced interrogation techniques. And by the way, there have been some practical proposals leading by defenders of torture to modernize it in a way that I didn't suggest. Some have suggested that, well, if we're going to do this, let's do it properly. And they've suggested a good technique is needles under the fingernails because they can be sterilized before you use them. And also you can have a proper warrant, torture warrants. Now, is this, these are not jokes of mine, these are things which have actually been seriously proposed. So the evils we think we put behind ourselves forever keep coming back. And the way I think of politics is not as an attempt to move further and further into a better and better future. But the way we should think of politics is the way it actually is, in fact, which is politics is and should consist of a succession of temporary expedients for dealing with recurring evils. And we should never get too hung up on the institutions we get involved with, which we put our trust in. Democracy is a wonderful thing, but it's not always possible. If you attempt to achieve it in certain circumstances, you may find that you produce anarchy. Let me give you a different example. Like many people, I was very stirred and inspired by the revolution again in Egypt against the corrupt and dictatorial regime of Mubarak. But when it happened, and when I saw in the world press and in 24-hour news that this was a triumph of open networks, this was a triumph of the social media, I began to have doubts. Because I thought it would end sadly and tragically. It hasn't ended yet. I may prove to be wrong. But what I thought was the following. What I thought is that in any revolutionary situation, not just in Egypt, but in Russia, in Europe, all the way back throughout the world's history, those institutions which prevail are the ones that have been most cohesive and most hierarchical for longest and are the best led and the most effective. So in Egypt, I anticipated, I wrote this, what will happen is some kind of cohabitation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army. Why? Because they're the only two institutions that fill. Now that's partly because there was a terrible dictatorship for over 40 years, so other institutions couldn't grow up, obviously. But open sources can't change that. The developments which have in fact happened would be ones which Machiavelli, writing several centuries ago, would have understood and predicted, and which Machiavelli, writing several centuries ago, was in fact emulating the Roman historians of 2,000 years ago. So it's a completely classical story of revolution. Now, an interesting question is this. Why are flat management structures, why are unbossed systems possible in business but not in politics? Why is this? In other words, why can you have open networks as being so important in the economy nowadays and not in politics? I think the reason is that the open networks can only really flourish against the background of relative stability. When the institutional framework, the infrastructure of the whole society, the law, the state, is up for grabs, then you get a kind of naked struggle for power. And in that revolutionary situation, as in Russia, who prevailed? The Bolsheviks. How large were the Bolsheviks? They were small. What advantage did they have? They were led by a very gifted leader who imposed his will throughout the party. All the other groups we've almost forgotten. Who now remembers the cadets, the Russian liberals? Who now remembers all the groups that made up the socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, social democrats, all kinds? They are among the casualties of history that have been forgotten. So technologies transform our experience. Technologies increase and enhance human power. We can do many things we couldn't do before as a result of technology. We can get healthy longevity, to go back to my first example. We can get more years of healthy longevity as a result of technology, medical technology. What technology can't do, what technical fixes can't do, is to make the human animal more reasonable, to make the human animal more civilized. Because one of the paradoxes of the human animal is, on the one hand, civilization is natural for humans. We would never have had the great civilizations we've had and have now if civilization hadn't been a natural response, a natural development, a natural evolution of the human animal. Civilization didn't come, in my view, from God or from a few gurus or a few wise people. It comes from human beings. The trouble is, civilization is natural for humans, and so is barbarism. So the shift into barbarism, into cruelty, into pogroms, into torture, into revolutions in which the original revolutionaries, who might have been very sincere and idealistic people, are devoured and gobbled up and destroyed, is very, very easy and quick and recurrently happens. So that the kind of upward arc or spiral of progress we now see in science and in technology is really something that doesn't exist in ethics and in politics. Now, having said that, I should say that I myself am a great supporter of technical fixes. For example, I'm among those people who still defend, after Fukushima, I still defend nuclear power on ecological and other reasons. In principle, although there are risks, I favor genetically modified foods. I'm very interested in experiments such as the experiments in vertical farming. Some of you may have read about or heard about. with layered farms which are being developed in America and in Singapore, anywhere where there is a shortage of land. I'm interested in and excited by many of the technologies which have been exposed to us today. I think they're all absolutely thrilling. But as some of those people who are talking about them pointed out, all these technologies are deeply ambiguous in one sense. It depends how they're used. They can be used, all of them, for good and bad purposes. Now, I should say, trying to criticize myself, because when I don't do it, I know other people will. I was trying to think of a technology that has no bad results. A technology that was entirely benign. And I did come up with one, you may be surprised to hear, anesthetic dentistry. And I came across that by rereading the English writer, early 19th century essayist Thomas de Quincey, who was an opium addict. He wrote a Confessions of an Opium Addict. And if you read in there, he says, and remember, this is progress. I don't deny there was any progress in history. He says, 1/4 of all human suffering is toothache. He became an opium addict, he says, in order to deal with his toothache. It's also one of the few things, there are books that people don't defend. There are books defending slavery. Aristotle did it. There are even a few defending torture. I haven't yet found one defending toothache. As an essential part of the richness of life, that without toothache we will be deprived of something profoundly meaningful, which as it were enables us to see the full depth of the human condition. Maybe Heidegger thought that, I don't know, but so where does that leave us? Well, what I would like to do is, first of all, to suggest to you that there might be this lack of parallelism, this contrast between the undoubted fact, I would say it's simply a fact, and a very exciting fact, of progress in science and technology, whereby our knowledge and our power as human beings is not just getting greater, but is even getting greater at an accelerating rate, and non-progress in ethics and politics, in civilization. We've had great advances in the last 50 years. Women have been tremendously emancipated. Gays are becoming more and more equal members of society, so that even our Conservative Prime Minister in England is adamant that marriage should be extended to gays, which I support also myself. Big changes and progresses, but they're all reversible. They all can be lost in a moment. They can all be lost by fundamental shifts. So I'll conclude with another story, this time not one involving me, but some of you will have heard of, but many of you will not, who was a British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, back in the 20s and 30s, very successful British politician, but one who'd never been accused of having any ideas. He was not known ever to have read a book, or if he did publish a book, but it was on pig breeding. He was never known to have entertained an idea. And yet, at the end of his life, he gave a speech, this is true, in Cambridge. At the end of the speech, someone got up and said, "Mr. Baldwin, during your very distinguished career as a politician, was there an idea, a single idea, a big idea, that guided you?" And to everybody's complete amazement, Baldwin said, "There was." Everyone was aghast. What was it? So he said, "When I was a young man, I read a book," and by the way, this book is still in print, you can buy it on Amazon, by Sir Henry Maine, a great legal historian, called Ancient Law. And in this book, Sir Henry Maine presented the idea which inspired me, thrilled me, the idea that human history was a movement from societies that are based on status and command to societies that are based on freedom, consent, and contract. He said, and if you look back at history, Maine said, you can see that there's this gradual, not inevitable, not inexorable, but powerful movement whereby that process takes place. The movement, Baldwin said, which has occupied me throughout my life, which I've turned to whenever I've had a really difficult political problem or dilemma, I've gone back to this idea of Sir Henry Maines, that history is a movement from societies based on status and command to societies based on contract and consent. And he paused and looked at me and said, "Oh, was it the other way around?" Thank you.